The studio courtroom fell into a reverent, almost sacred silence as actor Jonathan Roumie leaned forward at his gleaming host desk. His trademark serious gaze, perfectly framed under designer lights, cut through the theatrical glow of his nationally syndicated Sacred Canvas, a dialogue on faith and form program. The set, lined in soft golds and cream whites, was designed to inspire awe. Yet tonight it radiates intimidating control. Across from him sat Osteen, pastor and television preacher Joel Osteen, not in his usual stadium pulpit, not delivering a sermon, just a man, calm, centered, wearing a simple navy suit and a wooden cross around his neck. His eyes held the kind of peace that unsettles the unprepared. What the audience of nearly 200 didn't know, many of them longtime followers of Roumie who'd flown in just to see their favorite actor live, was that they were about to witness something very different from the usual format. They expected a polite conversation about faith in modern culture, maybe some surface-level disagreements followed by inspirational platitudes. Instead, they were about to witness a confrontation that would shake the foundation of performative religion. Pastor Osteen, Roumie began, his voice articulate, but edged with a subtle intellectual condescension. You've built an enormous platform on sermons that some might call performances. So tell us, are you here to speak truth or simply to deliver another carefully crafted message? A few audience members chuckled nervously. This wasn't what they'd come for, but Pastor Joel Osteen didn't flinch. He simply looked at Roumie, then to the crowd, and finally back to the cameras as if speaking to someone far beyond the room. He smiled, not the smile of a man cornered, but of a man who had walked into the lion's den with his eyes wide open. "Mr. Roumie," he said softly, his voice carrying with a pastor's quiet resonance across the studio, "before we talk about performance, perhaps we should talk about principles, because I brought something with me today, something I believe your viewers deserve to see." Suddenly, the studio felt tighter. The camera zoomed in. Roumie's crew shifted behind the scenes, exchanging hurried glances. His producers whispered into their headsets. Something was off. This wasn't going to script. Before we go deeper into how pastor and television preacher Joel Osteen unraveled the facade on live television, don't forget to like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe. Because what's coming next isn't just a conversation, it's a reckoning. This moment had been months in the making. Roumie, increasingly vocal in his distaste for what he called symbolic Christians, preachers, speakers, and ministries who he claimed only play faith without living it, had taken veiled shots at Osteen multiple times on his show. Comments like, "Faith isn't about perfectly coiffed stages and inspirational slogans," or "People are confusing motivational speeches with spiritual depth." He never said Osteen's name, but the audience knew. Roumie was branding himself as the guardian of true belief, positioning himself above those who hadn't embodied a biblical figure or produced critically acclaimed faith-based content. Pastor Joel Osteen, on the other hand, had remained silent. He'd been advised to issue a statement. He declined. He prayed. He waited. He prepared. Because Pastor Joel Osteen hadn't stepped into the arena of pop theology to defend himself. He came to reveal something deeper. That true faith isn't flashy. It's forged quietly in silence, in obedience, and sometimes in confrontation. What made this moment so explosive wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was the collision of two worldviews, one built on glory and the other on grace. Pastor Joel Osteen had not risen to influence through acclaimed acting roles, critically praised screenplays, or artistic grants. His path was quieter, less televised in the traditional sense, more tested. He'd spent years in local ministry and community outreach, not for fame, but for the deeper call to embody truth, grace, and suffering. Long before a camera ever captured his nationally televised sermons, he'd been volunteering in addiction ministries, praying in silence with strangers, and walking beside those the church had forgotten. Unlike those who had inherited iconic roles or artistic platforms, Osteen had labored in the background, building trust, not an empire. He had no entourage, no PR team crafting slogans. What he had was weight, the kind that comes from carrying other people's pain with him in prayer. So when actor Jonathan Roumie had spent months on his show subtly mocking spiritual influencers who confused cinematic lighting with divine light, Pastor Joel Osteen had heard the message loud and clear. Roumie's references to preachers who pretend holiness but have no ministry had become more frequent. And though no names were spoken, the target was obvious. And Osteen had said nothing, not because He was weak because he was waiting. Now seated in Roumie's ornate studio, a set that resembled a sanctuary but felt more like a stage, he knew the time had come. Roumie, still playing the gracious host, leaned back with practiced calm and asked, "Pastor Osteen, you've inspired millions from your pulpit, but what have you actually done for the kingdom outside the bright lights and televised sermons? Any real grassroots ministries? Any real transformation, or is it just viral content?" A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was Roumie's home turf. The question was surgical, but Pastor Joel Osteen didn't blink. He leaned forward gently like a man who had heard this kind of challenge before, but never from someone who should have been an ally. "Mr. Roumie," Pastor Osteen began, his voice even and unhurried, "I welcome the question, and I'm happy to talk about the fruit. But before we go there, allow me to ask you something." Roumie tilted his head, curious. "When was the last time," Osteen continued, "you sat with a man in solitary confinement who said he hadn't been prayed for in 10 years? Not once. When was the last time you served communion in a rehab chapel where the wine was grape juice and the bread was broken Ritz crackers?" The room shifted, the mood changed. Roumie's smile stiffened. "I'm not trying to provoke," Pastor Osteen said, "only to establish context, because real ministry isn't always televised. Sometimes it looks like being there when nobody else shows up." The crowd grew silent again. This was not how guests usually spoke to actor Jonathan Roumie, not on his show. But this guest wasn't selling a message. He was living one. Roumie's brow furrowed slightly as he responded, "I've been embodying faith-based narratives since before you ever stepped onto a stage. Our work has helped thousands, millions connect with spiritual themes through art, inspiration, and storytelling. You can't measure impact by where you sit." "I agree," Pastor Osteen said quietly, "but you can measure it by where you stand and what you stand for when no one's watching." A quiet gasp traveled through the audience. The moment was charged. Roumie adjusted his cuffs, then pressed forward. "Let's talk specifics then. You've spoken at prayer events, done interviews, given inspiring messages. But what tangible transformation have you brought to the body of Christ? What souls have been saved through your work?" This was meant to corner him, but Pastor Joel Osteen had not come unarmed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash documents. He simply said, "3 weeks ago, I received a letter from a death row inmate in Louisiana. He saw one of my messages, not the delivery, but the prayer behind it. He told me that for the first time in 22 years, he believed God might still want him." He paused. "He's asked for a priest. He's asked to reconcile with his daughter. That's not my doing, Mr. Roumie. That's grace. But I was willing to be a vessel." There was no comeback for that. Jonathan Roumie shifted in his seat, and somewhere off camera, a stage manager whispered, "This wasn't supposed to go like this." Because unlike a studio pulpit, real ministry isn't built on branding. Pastor Osteen continued quietly, "It's built on breaking bread with the broken, on sitting beside the addict, the prisoner, the forgotten. That's something you might understand, Mr. Roumie, if you spent more time in the margins instead of criticizing those of us who actually served there." The tension surged again. Jonathan Roumie's staff behind the cameras fidgeted. This wasn't their usual rhythm. This wasn't supposed to be a confrontation. It was supposed to be a showcase. But pastor and television preacher Joel Osteen had come with something more powerful than charisma. He had truth. Roumie's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward as if returning to a more familiar posture of control. "All right, Pastor Osteen," he said, his voice now tinged with something less polished. "Let's talk specifics then. This ministry outreach you have been so vocal about on social media, prison visits, grassroots discipleship, all of it. It's been talked about for months, yet we see no big campaigns, no large-scale funding. Meanwhile, souls are still lost, families still broken. Doesn't that make it performance without progress?" Some in the audience nodded. Roumie sounded reasonable, grounded in results. But Pastor Joel Osteen didn't flinch. He waited a beat, then said softly, "Well, since you brought that up, I think it's only fair to share something with your audience. Something they may not have seen in your interviews." He reached down beside his chair and lifted a folder. Simple, unadorned, thick. He didn't hold it like a prop. He held it like a testimony. "3 weeks ago," Pastor Osteen said evenly, "your production company, Sacred Canvas Studios, signed a $2.3 million contract with Zion Reach Holdings, a firm whose parent company runs several privately owned detention centers across the South, the same company that lobbies against prison reform and profits from keeping families apart. The studio gasped. Roumie's face twitched, the smoothness cracking just slightly. "That's not public knowledge," he said, trying to recover his composure. Osteen's voice stayed gentle but firm. "Actually, it is public record. Signed the same week you launched your national interview series criticizing radical mercy movements in the church." Audience members shifted in their seats. Camera operators moved closer. The control room erupted in whispered chaos. Producers debating whether to cut to commercial, but the ratings were climbing too fast to interrupt. Pastor Osteen opened the folder with the quiet precision of someone who had prepared for this moment down to the breath. "Here it is." He held it up, showing the front page. "Consulting and content production services, $2.3 million. And here," he flipped another page, "is an internal email from Zion Reach's communications director, thanking your executive producer for helping reframe the public's emotional response to criminal justice through faith-based media." Roumie stood up abruptly, his voice rising. "How dare you come on my program and accuse me of this? You don't know the full picture." Pastor Osteen didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached for a second document. "I do, actually. I made sure I did my homework before ever stepping onto this stage." By now, phones had been pulled out across the audience. Social media feeds were already lighting up with screenshots, hashtags, and captions. Hashtag Osteen confronts Roumie. Hashtag truth versus performance. How is this the end of the brand? Roumie was no longer smiling. He gripped the edge of his desk, and for the first time in his televised career, he looked unprepared. Pastor Osteen stood, not for drama, not to grandstand, but because what he was about to say could not be spoken sitting down. He walked slowly toward Roumie's desk, the soft thud of his footsteps punctuated by breathless silence. "You ask me what I've accomplished," he said, his voice low but unmistakably commanding. "Before I answer, I think this room deserves to understand why you're asking." The lights in the studio seemed to dim, though no one touched the controls. Pastor Osteen lifted the folder, held it before the cameras, and said calmly, "This isn't about doctrine. It's not about style. It's about whether we still recognize the difference between a preacher of hope and a salesman of comfort." And just like that, the power shifted. Roumie said nothing. He couldn't, because the next thing held up wasn't another contract. It was a photograph, a grainy image of a holding cell. A boy, no older than 15, curled up on a bench with a Bible clutched to his chest. "The boy in this photo," Pastor Osteen said quietly, "wrote to me last month. He said one of your interviews was playing on the television in his cell. He said it made him feel worse, not because of what you said, but because he thought God had forgotten about people like him." A long silence. Pastor Osteen set the photo down with reverence, like it was holy. "And I wrote him back, not with promises of breakthrough or success, just with presence, just with prayer. And last week I baptized him through a glass wall." The audience was weeping now. No one clapped. It was too sacred for that. "You've built your career on embodying grace," Pastor Osteen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped listening to the groaning of the saints." Pastor Osteen opened the folder and gently pulled out a document, holding it up so the cameras and the crowd could see it clearly. "This," he said solemnly, "is a contract between your production company, Sacred Canvas Productions, and Zion Reach Holdings, one of the largest for-profit correctional contractors in the United States. $2.3 million over 3 years for what they call faith-based narrative consulting and content development." The crowd gasped. Some covered their mouths. Others instinctively reached for their phones. The silence was instantly broken by the sound of camera shutters and recording icons blinking red. Jonathan Roumie's face ran through a carousel of emotion. Confusion, indignation, then just for a flicker, fear. "That's a business contract," he protested, his usually polished voice suddenly thinner. "It has nothing to do with my message or my heart for justice." Pastor Osteen offered a quiet, almost compassionate smile. Not smug, not theatrical, but the kind of expression you give when you've been underestimated for far too long. "Really?" Pastor Osteen said, pulling out a second page. "Because this email from Zion Reach's VP of Government Relations to your executive producer tells a very different story." Roumie began to speak. "You can't just..." But Pastor Osteen was already reading. "Thank you for agreeing to help shift the narrative on criminal justice reform. The recent surge of grassroots compassion, especially from voices like Osteen, is threatening to destabilize our legislative leverage. Having Mr. Roumie challenge the effectiveness of these movements will be a strategic win for our long-term positioning." The studio exploded. Audience members shouted questions. Others simply sat frozen, stunned by the naked language of manipulation. Jonathan Roumie looked as if he'd been struck, but Pastor Osteen wasn't finished. "You question what I've done for the kingdom, Mr. Roumie," Pastor Osteen said, reaching once more into his briefcase. "Allow me to show you." He pulled out a thick stack of printed pages. "This is the Mercy Reentry Initiative, a faith-based rehabilitation framework I've co-developed with chaplain, former inmates, and trauma specialists. It's currently being piloted in 3 federal prisons. The early results show a 38% reduction in repeat offenses." Gasps again, whispers. "And this," he said, lifting another paper, "is the Restoration Code, our transparency model tying church funding to ethical accountability. It's being adopted by 7 dioceses across the country. And here," he held up one more page, "is the Justice Without Profit Act. I helped write it. It's now sitting before the Senate with bipartisan support. It would sever ties between private prisons and faith-based media partnerships like yours." Roumie tried to interrupt. "Those are just ideas, proposals. Anyone can propose something." "You're right," Pastor Osteen said, gently cutting him off. "Anyone can start something, but not everyone can get a broken system to listen. And certainly not everyone can do it without compromise." Applause erupted, not staged, not polite, but raw. Pastor Osteen raised a hand, not to celebrate, but to still the moment. "Let's be clear, Mr. Roumie," he said, now walking toward the desk. "While you've spent 20 years crafting acclaimed portrayals in front of HD cameras, I've spent my life in ordinary places. I've baptized gang members in rehab centers. I've held the hands of dying men who hadn't heard the name Jesus without a curse in decades. I've sat in broken down trailers with families torn apart by incarceration. And I've never once taken a dollar from the people who profit from their suffering." He stepped closer. "You want to talk about my online following? Fine. Let's talk about how my live stream from the Phoenix Detention Center led to an official DIOJ investigation into inmate mistreatment, or how my testimony before Congress helped strip corporate faith-based programming from for-profit prison contracts, or how one prayer post led to 3 executives getting indicted for misusing federal reentry funds." Roumie sat back, visibly shaken. He, the man who had built his career on asking intellectual questions and smiling through discomfort, now sat in stunned silence as someone finally held him accountable. Pastor Osteen turned slowly, facing the audience and the cameras directly. "This is the sickness in our system," he said, voice strong but grieving. "People build platforms, get comfortable, get rich, and forget what we were called to do in the first place. They speak about grace, but avoid sacrifice. They quote the Sermon on the Mount, but live like kings on golden hills." The room was dead silent. Even the camera crew stood still. "You asked what I've accomplished, Mr. Roumie," he concluded, returning to his chair. "I've done something you haven't done in 20 years of your career. I've shown people the face of Christ without selling access to it. I've walked into places you wouldn't dare go with nothing but a prayer in my pocket. I've helped free people, not just from prison, but from despair. And I did it without bowing to mammon and fun." He finally sat down, folded his hands, and smiled. "Now, Mr. Roumie," he asked gently, "did you have any other questions about my walk?" By the time the program finished airing on the West Coast, Had a Roumie Exposed was already trending worldwide. But it wasn't just Twitter. Once full clips hit YouTube and TikTok, beginning with Pastor Joel Osteen calmly holding up the Zion Reach contract and ending with Jonathan Roumie frozen in silence, the internet erupted. In just 24 hours, the takedown video had been viewed over 2.3 million times, becoming one of the most watched faith-based confrontations in online history. Comments flooded in from across every demographic, Catholic, evangelical, even secular audiences. I've watched Jonathan Roumie's work for a decade. I've never seen anyone turn the stage on him like that. Pastor Joel Osteen just reminded the world what the church is actually supposed to look like. Another viral comment read, "This is what happens when you try to perform faith in front of someone who actually lives it." Even conservative religious commentators, typically allies of Roumie, were forced to acknowledge the moment. One Baptist blogger wrote, "I don't agree with Pastor Joel Osteen's prosperity gospel teachings or his megachurch model, but I can't deny this. He came prepared. He spoke the truth, and he held a mirror up to someone who's been untouchable for far too long." Mainstream media coverage didn't just echo the virality, it amplified it. CNN ran the headline, Pastor Joel Osteen outshines acclaimed actor in live faith confrontation. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow dedicated an entire segment titled From Pulpit to Principle, The Pastor Who Unveiled Truth. The New York Times published a Sunday feature, The Business of Belief, What Osteen's Revelation Says About Faith and Finance. The Washington Post fact-checkers went to work confirming every document Pastor Osteen had revealed, including the email from Zion Reach. The confirmation only deepened the blow. Even international media joined in. The BBC called the confrontation a symbol of the coming generational shift in Christian leadership. A French Catholic paper wrote, Osteen n'a pas seulement prêché la vérité, il l'a vécu cette nuit. Osteen didn't just preach the truth, he lived it that night. But the most shocking turn came from Fox News. Tucker Carlson, not known for praising megachurch pastors or those perceived as prosperity gospel preachers, said on air, I disagree with a lot of what Osteen probably believes, but I'll say this. That man stood his ground. He didn't shout. He didn't spin. He used facts. He used faith. He made an acclaimed actor's career look very, very small. Republicans could learn something from that kind of composure. Even Sean Hannity reluctantly admitted, Pastor Osteen is not my kind of Christian leader, but I respect what he did. He came in with evidence, not drama. He didn't back down when someone with more fame and fortune tried to steamroll him. The damage to actor Jonathan Roumie's brand was swift and brutal. By sunrise, hashtags like Roumie ethically compromised and art for profit exposed were trending beside Osteen. Journalists who had once brushed off Roumie's business affiliations as standard began looking deeper. What they found was worse than anyone expected. The $2.3 million Zion Reach contract was just the beginning. Further investigations revealed that over the past 6 years, Roumie's media subsidiaries had accepted more than $9.1 million into production deals, endorsements, and consulting agreements with companies tied to the private incarceration industry, faith-based financial schemes, and even corporate redemption coaching programs targeting ex-offenders. His hometown paper, the Los Angeles Times, ran the front-page headline, The Art of Optics, Roumie's Empire, and the Profits of Penance. The article detailed a sprawling web of nonprofits, shell companies, and speaker fees, all tied back to Roumie's brand, a brand that had positioned itself as grace-filled and untouchable. Now that halo was cracking. Roumie tried to recover. He appeared on several talk shows in damage control mode, repeating lines like, My business dealings are separate from my artistic work and faith teachings. I've always followed what God put on my heart, but the charm didn't land. On The View, Whoopi Goldberg asked him directly, Jonathan, you've built your entire brand on uplifting spiritual narratives, but how do you not see that people also deserve transparency, especially when your artistic choices shape how millions understand justice and mercy? He didn't have a good answer. The sponsors noticed too. Within a week, 3 of the biggest corporate backers of Jonathan Roumie's broadcast programs quietly pulled their support, citing ethical concerns and lack of transparency regarding financial entanglements. For years, the ratings of Sacred Canvas, a dialogue on faith and form, had been slowly slipping, masked by polished stagecraft and celebrity endorsements. But after the Osteen confrontation, viewership plummeted by 30%, a cliff drop that no amount of branding could disguise. While Jonathan Roumie's career reeled, Pastor Joel Osteen's inbox overflowed. In the first 72 hours, his team reported over 50,000 messages from clergy, seminarians, recovering addicts, prison chaplains, and ordinary believers. Over 90% expressed profound support, many calling the moment a spiritual awakening or the confrontation the church desperately needed. Donations surged to the Mercy Reentry Initiative, the grassroots program Pastor Osteen had quietly co-founded years earlier. More importantly, doors that had long been shut began to open. Catholic dioceses, evangelical networks, and even interfaith prison reform groups reached out seeking his counsel. 2 Protestant denominations officially adopted elements of Osteen's Restoration Code as part of their financial ethics standards. And the Justice Without Profit Act, once buried in committee, was now gaining bipartisan attention with 3 new co-sponsors by the week's end. Even leaders who disagreed with him theologically couldn't deny what they had witnessed. Look, said a prominent Baptist pastor on his podcast, I don't agree with Osteen on everything, but what he did, that was conviction with spine. He came in with facts, he came in with grace, and he handled the most powerful Christian media personality in the world without flinching. That's not acting, that's ministry. The impact went far beyond Roumie's studio or Osteen's pulpit. Seminaries, divinity schools, and communications programs began analyzing the exchange in detail. It quickly became a case study in spiritual leadership under pressure, taught not as performance but as a model of principled courage. Harvard Divinity School and Notre Dame's Kroc Institute both added the full transcript to their curriculum. A course at Yale School of Sacred Media began using the clip to teach the ethics of public witness in faith broadcasting. On the Liturgist podcast, theologian and writer Mike McCarr called it not just a media moment, but a sacramental act of truth-telling, grace under fire. Even political strategist James Carville, not a faith leader by any stretch, weighed in on his show. Roumie tried to use his power, experience, and aura to knock Osteen off balance, but Osteen flipped him. He made Roumie's aura look like ego. That wasn't preaching, that was theological jujitsu. Osteen's confrontation didn't just expose one man's contradictions. It lit a match in the dark corners of faith media. In the weeks that followed, multiple actors in faith-based films and Christian commentators were forced to disclose their financial partnerships, especially with corporations that profited from incarceration, healthcare debt, or predatory faith-based programs. Major networks introduced new transparency standards. The Evangelical Press Association updated its ethics charter to include clear language on corporate influence. And the Society of Christian Broadcasters released a joint statement admitting that Osteen's moment had sparked an overdue reckoning. For younger spiritual leaders, especially those from underrepresented communities, Pastor Joel Osteen became something more than a television preacher. He became a blueprint, a quiet, reverent counterexample to the showmanship that had come to define so much of modern ministry. As Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wrote in a now viral tweet, "Sometimes the most prophetic thing you can do is stay calm and speak the truth, especially when truth makes people squirm." Osteen showed that the new voice of leadership isn't loud, it's deeply rooted. What the world saw that night wasn't a performance, it was presence. And for anyone still watching, one message rose above the noise. If you build your platform on appearance, one moment of truth can unravel it. But if you build your life on truth, no platform can contain it. If you believe that truth should be spoken with grace and that quiet conviction is more powerful than polished performance, then this is just the beginning. We're telling the stories others are too afraid to touch, and we're doing it with reverence, preparation, and fire. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next reckoning, revelation, or moment of clarity. Because sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that doesn't raise itself, but raises the standard. Join us.